Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's pretty formidable. We're cracking open one of the most ambitious policy blueprints in modern political history.
Mhm.
We're going to strip away the noise, try to give you a clear, impartial roadmap of these proposals for really fundamental change across the U.S. federal government.
Yeah, we're diving deep into Project 2025, Presidential Transition Project.
Yeah.
And this thing is massive. It's spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation, got support from scores of conservative organizations,
Right.
and it's designed really to be the definitive guide for the next conservative administration, right from day one.
And to really get the gravity of this, you kind of have to look back historically. The sources themselves link this project straight to the 1980 election, specifically the mandate for leadership.
The Reagan playbook.
Exactly. That document basically gave the incoming Reagan administration its policy marching orders. And remarkably, within Reagan's first year, something like over 60% of its recommendations were actually enacted.
That tells you right away, doesn't it?
Right.
Project 2025 isn't just, some academic exercise.
Yeah.
It's strategic, it's comprehensive, it's explicitly designed to, quote, arm the next conservative president for what the authors are calling a new age. They don't see it just as a plan for governing. It's more like a plan for seizing control of the government apparatus.
And the central diagnosis, it's laid out immediately and it's stark. The core conflict they identify is that the federal government itself is, and this is their description, a behemoth weaponized against American citizens and conservative values.
Yeah, they argue freedom itself is under siege.
Mm-hmm.
And the explicit goal, stated right up front, is to reverse what they term the long march of cultural Marxism through our institutions.
It's strong language.
Very strong. And it's vital for you, the listener, to grasp the sheer scope here. This isn't just like a few policy points.
No, it's a manual.
It's a whole manual, yeah. Covering 4 integrated pillars: a common policy agenda, personnel recruitment and vetting, that's huge transition planning for the first 180 days, and then a detailed schedule for immediate action.
And the recommendations touch, pretty much everything, right?
Everything from the deep structures, like the civil service, reorienting the Defense Department, all the way to foreign trade, energy policy, even the definition of the family. It's incredibly wide-ranging.
Okay, let's try to unpack this. It's monumental. Where do we start? Maybe with the philosophical foundation.
Makes sense. That kind of underpins everything else.
All right, so the core philosophical goal, it's laid out in what they call promise, #2. Dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. Dismantle. Why is dismantling government seen as like a moral imperative here, not just about cutting budgets?
Well, the rationale they provide goes way beyond just saving money. The
Yeah.
source states that conservatives want a smaller government, not for its own sake, but for the sake of human flourishing.
Human flourishing. Okay.
The argument is that this unaccountable administrative state, as they see it, actively interferes with individual liberty, with economic vitality, basically, with people living their lives.
So the implication is that the existing bureaucracy, the sort of Washington establishment, actively pushes back against this.
Absolutely. The plan argues that this resistance is basically baked in. Why? Because smaller government, more accountability. Well, that means losing power for the bureaucracy itself. They argue it's developed its own self-interest,
Yeah.
And that interest is often different from, or even contradicts, the interests of the political leadership that the American people elected.
And the legal hook for this massive overhaul, it seems to rest squarely on Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive power clause.
Precisely. That's the central legal lever they plan to pull. The argument is straightforward. If the Constitution vests all federal executive power in the president, then, quote, it is the president's agenda that should matter to the departments and agencies, not their own.
Right. Not the agency's agenda.
Exactly. The explicit critique is that these agency bureaucracies often end up carrying out, its own policy plans, or, as the sources claim, the plans and preferences of a radical, supposedly woke faction of the country.
So the tools they outline to fix this, they're not exactly subtle, are they? This sounds like aiming for total control.
It really is. The plan lays out explicit tools to reclaim that executive power. It calls for firing federal bureaucrats who are often seen as, unfireable.
Okay.
It talks about shuttering what they deem wasteful and corrupt bureaus and offices. And it includes actively muzzling what the document calls woke propaganda at every level of the federal government.
Wow.
The intent is clearly to use the presidential mandate right from day one to just overcome that institutional resistance.
Which makes personnel absolutely critical, doesn't it? If the agencies are seen as the problem, you need people totally aligned with the mission, sitting in the White House, steering the ship.
Yes. That's a huge focus of the transition strategy, making sure the White House itself is this nerve center, deeply committed to the president's vision. They actually highlight 3 specific roles as crucial for making this happen. First up, the White House Counsel.
The counsel's office. Isn't that usually seen as sort of the check, the legal guardrail on presidential power?
Traditionally, yes. But the plan wants to reorient that. It says the council must actively protect presidential powers. They need to offer practical legal advice on how to promote the president's agenda within the bounds of the law.
Okay.
And the sources stress they must not erect roadblocks out of an abundance of caution. They need to be problem solvers for the president's goals, not obstacles.
Interesting shift. What's the second role?
The staff secretary. Now, this might sound kind of minor, administrative,
Yeah, I was going to say.
but the document describes this role as the last substantive control point before anything papers, decision memos, briefing books hits the Oval Office desk.
Ah, the gatekeeper.
Exactly. Given the sheer volume of information a president sees, the staff secretary basically filters it.
Yeah.
They play a key role in deciding whose input actually influences those final policy decisions. Control the paper flow, you control the policy, right?
Makes sense. And the third key role, personnel.
The Office of Personnel, or PPO. This is described as the absolute critical link between conservative organizations and the executive branch. Its task is just monumental.
Staffing, right.
Staffing thousands, literally thousands, of non-career positions during the first term. The goal is to ensure policy alignment across every single department and agency. The authors believe flat out, without aligned personnel, you simply cannot effectively control or redirect the administrative state.
Okay, so you've got the legal framework, the key White House roles. How do they plan to enforce this mandate financially? You mentioned the budget earlier.
Right, the budget, often seen as just numbers on a page, but the plan calls a powerful mechanism for setting and enforcing public policy.
So how do they leverage it?
They propose a really crucial administrative overhaul within the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. They suggest restructuring OMB's 6 large resource management offices, the RMOs,
Restructuring how?
breaking them down into smaller, more focused subject matter areas, and crucially, installing additional political leadership within those smaller offices.
Why that specific structure? What does that achieve?
Well, the RMOs are the main points of contact between OMB and all the federal agencies on budget stuff. By making them smaller, more specialized, and embedding political appointees deeper within them,
You get more control.
you get much greater, more granular policy direction and oversight of how agencies are actually spending their money. It's about ensuring the budget choices align with the president's policy, not, the agency's own preferences or inertia.
And they detail something called administrative pay-as-you-go, or PA-go. That sounds technical, but interesting. How does that enforce discipline?
It's actually a pretty clever mechanism on paper. PAYGO basically means imposing budget neutrality on the agency's discretionary policy choices.
So if an agency wants to start some new initiative that isn't mandated by law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to find a way to pay for it internally. They need to find an equal offset somewhere else in their budget before they spend a dime on the new thing.
Ah, okay.
It forces the executive branch to control what it can control, to enforce fiscal responsibility within its own operations without needing Congress for every little thing.
All right, so that's the top-level strategy. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this philosophical goal translates into concrete changes for the federal workforce itself. The source material seems to view the current bureaucracy as, well, deeply broken. It claims the federal government's bureaucracy cannot even meet its own civil service ideals of merit and performance.
Yeah, the critique starts right at the very beginning, hiring. The sources argue pretty strongly that for, 34 years now, the U.S. civil service has allegedly been unable to consistently tell the difference between strong applicants and unqualified ones. They say this undermines the whole idea of meritocracy.
And they trace this back to a specific moment, right? Something in the late 70s, early 80s. The abolition of the PACE exam. What exactly was PACE?
PACE stood for Professional and Administrative Career Examination. It was essentially a general intelligence test, kind of like the SATs, but for government jobs, used to select college grads for entry-level professional positions.
Okay.
The sources state this exam was abolished through a legal consent decree back in 1981. This followed concerns and lawsuits about its potential disparate impact on minority applicants.
Right.
But here's the crucial claim the authors make. They say that judicial decree was only supposed to last for 5 years. Yet they argue the consequences of getting rid of it still plague federal hiring today. They claim it led to this inability to properly assess knowledge, skills, and abilities as federal law actually requires.
So if hiring is seen as broken, accountability for existing employees must be the next big piece. The plan calls for reintroducing a Trump administration executive order, EO 13839. Remind us, what did that EO actually do?
That order was specifically designed to speed up the process for dealing with poor performance among federal employees. It mandated reducing the time employees have to improve their performance before, corrective action could be taken.
Making it faster to discipline or remove someone?
Exactly. And it required managers to initiate those disciplinary actions against poor performers more quickly. The goal was clearly to shift the system away from one that, in their view, overly privileges job protection towards one focused squarely on mission execution. Get the job done.
And the plan also stresses that political executives need to be actively supervising performance appraisals, not just leaving it to career managers.
Yes, precisely. This ensures that career managers aren't the only ones defining what good performance looks like. By injecting political leadership people appointed by the president into the appraisal process,
You tie performance to the administration's goals.
you got it. You create a direct line of accountability from the Oval Office's policy goals right down to the individual employee's performance standards.
Now, when it comes to actually firing people, the complexity of the appeals process is highlighted as a major barrier. The document cites the non-military government dismissal rate as well below 1%. That sounds incredibly low.
It does sound low, and the sources explain this low rate by comparing it to the private sector. There, they say appeals are typically a quick, maybe two-step internal process.
Right.
The federal system, though, it's this complex, multi-step appeals process. You've got the Merit Systems Protection Board involved. The sources argue it's so complex, so time-consuming, and so prone to being overturned that it actively discourages managers from even trying to remove poor performers.
So it effectively creates tenure, even if it's not called that.
That's the argument, a de facto system of tenure that the plan aims to dismantle completely.
The plan also touches on costs, specifically pension reform. It recalls the Reagan-era shift from the old CSRS system to the current FERS system.
Yeah, that was a huge reform back in 1986. CSRS, the Civil Service Retirement System, was getting really expensive. FERS, the Federal Employees Retirement System, drastically cut the cost as a percentage of payroll. How? By shifting more of the pension cost burden and, importantly, the investment risk onto the employee through things like the Thrift Savings Plan, which is like a 401k.
And the sources suggest continuing down that path.
Yeah, they suggest looking for more ways to reduce the retirement expense for the taxpayer.
Okay, and one more element here. Public sector unions, what's the take?
The recommendation is pretty direct. Congress should consider whether public sector unions are appropriate in the first place.
Wow, question their very existence.
Yes. The document cites what it calls a historical bipartisan consensus against public sector unionization, going back decades. And it raises concerns that these unions often frustrate good government management because their priority is protecting members, sometimes, they argue, at the expense of mission efficiency or flexibility.
All right, let's pivot to defense. The Department of Defense, DoD. The mandate here seems crystal clear. Stop what they call the left's social experimentation with the military and get back to basics. Restore war fighting as its sole mission with a laser focus on China.
Exactly. Defeating the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is explicitly named as the central organizing principle for the military's future.
And that requires immediate reversals of certain personnel policies.
Yes, very specific ones. The plan advocates reversing policies that allow transgender individuals to serve openly. It states quite bluntly that gender dysphoria is incompatible with the demands of military service.
Okay.
It also calls for ending the use of any public money for transgender surgeries or for facilitating abortion access for service members. The argument is that these resources need to be directed purely towards military readiness and lethality.
And these changes aren't just about personnel rules. They go right into military education, like the service academies.
They do. They propose a thorough audit of all course offerings at the military academies, specifically to remove Marxist indoctrination. That's the term used.
Marxist indoctrination.
Yes. And they also want to eliminate academic tenure for professors at the academies, arguing that academics working for the military should be held to the same accountability standards as any other DoD contractor or employee.
And beyond the academies, are there calls for changes in the services themselves?
Oh yeah, there are detailed calls across the board. Things like expanding the Navy's force structure, more ships, increasing the Air Force budget by a set amount like 5% annually after inflation, and transforming the Marine Corps personnel system to try and keep experienced junior NCOs from leaving. It's quite specific.
Okay, so if dismantling the administrative state is pillar one, maybe repositioning culture is pillar two. Let's move into the domestic sphere. Promise, #arrow in the document, focuses on restoring the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. The argument seems to be that federal power needs to be actively used to reverse what they see as a crisis in the family.
Yeah, it's not just about responding to symptoms. It's about actively promoting a certain vision of the family. And you see this through very specific, targeted policies aimed at family formation and cohesion.
Like what, for example?
Well, things like eliminating marriage penalties in federal welfare programs and in the tax code. These are mechanisms that, critics argue, currently penalize lower-income couples if they get married because their combined income might reduce their benefits.
Right, I've heard about that.
They also strongly advocate for installing work requirements for food stamps, SNAP. The explicit goal here is to use government levers, including the tax system, to actively incentivize and, in their view, restore the traditional American family structure.
Okay, let's turn to Health and Human Services, HHS. This seems like a major battleground in the plan, targeting policies seen as fundamentally against conservative values, especially around abortion and life issues.
Oh, absolutely. This section is packed, just packed, with specific actionable items. The sources mandate that the FDA must reverse its approval of chemical abortion drugs, mifepristone, from back in 2000.
Reverse the approval entirely. On what grounds?
They argue the original approval process itself was politicized and illegal. And this reversal wouldn't just ban it, it would immediately reinstate the safety protocols that are in place before later changes.
What kind of protocols?
Things like limiting the gestation time for its use back down to 49 days, restoring the requirement for it to be dispensed in person by a medical provider. So, no mail-order abortion pills, and requiring prescribers to report all serious adverse events, not just deaths, which they claim isn't happening adequately now.
That's a huge rollback. What else in HHS?
Well, relatedly, the plan calls for prohibiting Planned Parenthood specifically from receiving any federal Medicaid funds. Full stop.
Okay, so sweeping actions on abortion access and funding. Does this theme extend to other areas within HHS, like identity and conscience rights?
It does, very strongly. The plan instructs the next HHS secretary to vigorously protect conscience rights for healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses who object to certain procedures on moral or religious grounds, and it calls for upholding bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology.
What does that mean in practice?
It means immediately reversing the current administration's focus on, and these are terms from the document, LGBTQ plus equity, subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriage. And, crucially, they plan to withdraw all federal support, funding, and guidance for cross-sex medical interventions and what's commonly called gender-affirming care, especially for minors.
Oh, okay. The sources don't stop there, though, do they? They seem to launch a pretty deep critique aimed at the public health apparatus itself, CDC, NIH.
Yeah, this is a major area of, let's say, skepticism and proposed reform in the document. There's some pretty explosive claims made. Well, the sources allege that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, paid for research using aborted baby body parts. They also point to funding for gain-of-function viral research that may have been responsible for COVID-19.
Those are extremely serious allegations.
They are. And they also cite potential financial conflicts of interest. They note, for instance, that former NIA Director Anthony Fauci's division within NIH allegedly owns half the patent for the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine and claims several NIH employees received significant royalty payments from Moderna vaccine sales.
So they're presenting these claims as evidence of a massive failure, lack of transparency, conflicts of interest.
Exactly. Evidence, in their view, of a system that lacks scientific transparency and is potentially compromised by financial incentives and political agendas.
Given those critiques, what's the proposed structural solution for the public health agencies like CDC and NIH?
The sources conclude that the entire public health apparatus needs fundamental restructuring. This is about restoring public trust and ensuring democratic accountability. They argue clear, defined thresholds must be set for what actually constitutes a public health emergency.
And just as importantly,
And just as importantly, what triggers the end of such an emergency. The argument is that the government shouldn't be able to declare these open-ended emergencies indefinitely without clear metrics and legislative consent.
okay, let's shift gears to education. The plan for the Department of Education, DOE, isn't just about cuts, is it? It sounds like they propose its near total dissolution via something called the Department of Education Reorganization Act.
Yeah, dissolution is the right word. The vast majority of the department's current functions would either be transferred to other existing agencies or just eliminated entirely.
And what happens to the big federal funding program for schools, Title I? That's money for lower income districts.
Critically, Title I funding would be moved out of DOE altogether. It would be transferred over to HHS, specifically to the Administration for Children and Families, or ACF. And here's the key part. It would be administered as a no-strings-attached formula block grant.
Let's pause on that. No strings attached block grant. What's the practical effect of that? Why do it that way?
Well, the goal seems twofold. First, it guts the DOE's regulatory power over that money. If there are no strings, the federal government can't dictate how states and districts use it.
Right.
Second, by moving Title I to HHS and stripping away those federal mandates, it clears the path for aggressively advancing education freedom, which is code for school choice.
Ah, okay.
The sources explicitly want to allow the portability of existing federal education dollars. That means letting the money follow the student to whatever school the parents choose, public, private, charter, maybe even homeschool potentially, through things like education savings accounts, ESAs.
So, fundamentally changing how federal education money flows. What about Title IX? That's the law governing sex-based discrimination in education.
Yeah.
Big targets.
Huge target. The plan calls for amending Title IX in two major ways. First, defining the word sex within the law as meaning only biological sex recognized at birth.
That's a foundational shift.
It's a complete reversal of recent interpretations that include gender identity. Second, they want to add specific due process requirements into Title IX proceedings, particularly for students accused of sexual misconduct. This addresses long-standing conservative concerns that accused students, often male, lack adequate legal protections on campus.
And what about parental rights in schools, especially around gender identity issues?
The plan mandates that K-12 school districts receiving federal funds, which is most of them, must prohibit their officials from requiring teachers to accept a child's stated gender identity if it differs from their biological sex without notifying the parent.
So, ending policies where schools might support a student's social transition without parental knowledge.
Exactly. The authors explicitly state that policies preventing teachers from informing parents are designed, in their view, to drive a wedge between parents and children and undermine fundamental parental authority.
Okay, quickly rounding out the domestic agencies, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and Agriculture, USDA. What's the focus there?
For HUD, the main theme is ending what they call mission creep, getting back to basics. This includes proposals like explicitly barring non-citizens from living in federally assisted housing,
Okay.
and also mandating administrative changes to end Housing First directives for homelessness programs. They argue Housing First policies, which prioritize getting people into housing quickly without preconditions like sobriety, often fail because they don't address the root causes like addiction or mental illness.
And at USDA, the Department of Agriculture, a shift away from climate inequity.
Yes, the plan explicitly denounces efforts to prioritize things like climate change over core issues like food productivity and affordability. The priority should be defending efficient, innovative food production.
Do they get into specific farm policies?
They do. They detail, for example, the economic cost of the federal sugar program. Because it restricts supply to keep domestic prices high, they claim it costs American consumers up to $3.7 billion a year in higher food prices.
Wow, that's a big number for sugar. What about school meals?
They want to reform the big federal meal programs, the National School Lunch Program, NSLP, and the School Breakfast Program, SBP. The goal is to return them to what they see as their original purpose, serving children only from genuinely low-income families.
And the critique is aimed at
The Community Eligibility Provision, or CEP. This allows schools in high-poverty areas to offer free meals to all students, regardless of individual family income. The sources cite research suggesting this expanded free meals to many children from middle and even upper-income homes, which they argue is fiscally irresponsible and deviates from the program's intent.
All right, let's shift gears again now into national security. The proposals for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, sound massive. Significant structural cuts right off the bat, privatizing TSA screening, FEMA's flood insurance.
Yeah, those are big ones. Privatizing TSA screening at airports, that's been debated for years,
Yeah.
and shifting the National Flood Insurance Program, which is deeply in debt, potentially out of FEMA and maybe towards the private market.
But beyond just privatization, there's deep internal restructuring plan too.
Oh, yes. The plan proposes eliminating most of the grant programs that DHS runs grants to state and local governments for various security purposes, and, maybe most controversially, removing all unions from the department.
All unions, including Border Patrol, IC.
All of them. The justification given is explicitly national security purposes. The argument presented is that collective bargaining agreements interfere with management's flexibility to deploy personnel rapidly and respond effectively to security threats.
That would be a huge fight. On immigration enforcement specifically, the plan calls for a merging Border Patrol with OAM. What's OAM?
OAM is the Office of Air and Marine Operations within Customs and Border Protection. They handle surveillance and interdiction using aircraft and boats. So, merging the land-based Border Patrol with the air and sea capabilities of OAM, it's a classic move aimed at creating a more integrated, supposedly more efficient and flexible enforcement structure along the borders and coasts.
Any other specific enforcement measures mentioned?
Yes, they mandate restarting and expanding the use of Border Patrol agents on horseback, and, quite pointedly, they call for clearing the personnel records of those agents who were involved in that 2021 incident in Del Rio, Texas, the ones accused of whipping Haitian migrants. The plan says they were falsely accused, and their records should be expunged.
Okay. What about USCIS? That's the agency handling legal immigration, visa, citizenship. How does it fit into this?
USCIS would also be fundamentally reoriented. The demand is for it to return strictly to what they see as its core mission, being a screening and vetting agency, as opposed to its current priorities, which the sources argue include things like easing asylum eligibility standards and expanding various parole programs that allow people into the country without visas. They claim these policies have transformed USCIS into an open borders agency that actually exacerbates fraud and illegal immigration rather than controlling the legal flow.
This sounds like it bleeds into asylum and detention policy directly. The plan calls for Congress to repeal a section of the TVPRA and end the Flores settlement. Those are big legal pillars.
Huge ones. Repealing Section 235 of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. That section provides specific protections for unaccompanied migrant children, particularly regarding their removal or deportation if they might be trafficking victims. Repealing it could allow for much more rapid removal of minors arriving alone.
And Flores. That settlement governs the detention of migrant children, right?
Exactly. It's a 1997 court settlement that sets standards for how minors are treated in federal custody. Most famously, it limits how long children can generally be held in immigration detention, usually interpreted as around 20 days.
So how does the plan propose getting around Flores? You can't just ignore a court settlement.
They propose Congress step in and set new nationwide detention standards through legislation that would effectively override the settlement agreement. This legislation, they suggest, should explicitly allow for the large-scale use of temporary facilities, for example, tents, for holding families and potentially minors for much longer periods.
Wow, large-scale tent facilities for detention. What about the asylum standard itself?
They also want to raise the initial credible fear standard. That's the first hurdle an asylum seeker has to pass in an interview shortly after arriving. Raising that standard would make it significantly harder for migrants to even get their asylum case formally considered.
Okay, within DHS, there's also an intelligence component, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, INA. What's the plan there?
Elimination. It's recommended for complete elimination. The argument is twofold. First, that its functions are duplicative of what other agencies like the FBI and the broader intelligence community already do. Second, and this is a recurring theme, the sources allege that INA has been weaponized for domestic political purposes, essentially spying on Americans or targeting political opponents rather than focusing on actual foreign threats.
Okay, let's zoom out to the broader intelligence community, the IC. The overall goal seems to be using intelligence much more aggressively against adversaries, especially China.
Yes, especially China is emphasized repeatedly. To make that happen, the plan argues the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, needs a massive power boost.
More power how? The DNI already oversees the IC.
Nominally, yes. But the sources argue the DNI needs full budget authority and full personnel authority, hiring and firing power across all 18 intelligence agencies to effectively lead the community. They actually cite former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who apparently initially turned down the DNI job back when it was created. Because, Gates reportedly argued, the legislation creating the DNI position actually weakened community leadership because the DNI had, quote, no troops and no additional powers really on the budget, hiring and firing. The plan wants to fix that, make the DNI the true CEO of the entire IC.
And this empowerment is directly linked to countering China, including things like closing AFERA loopholes. Remind us what HEVRA is.
FERA is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. It requires individuals or firms representing foreign interests in the U.S. in a political or quasi-political capacity to disclose their relationship, activities, and funding.
And the concern is China is exploiting loopholes.
The concern is that Chinese entities, including companies and organizations linked to the CCP, are using loopholes in AFERA, particularly regarding commercial activities or lobbying disclosure, to conduct economic espionage and influence operations within the U.S. without adequate transparency. The plan aims to tighten those loopholes significantly.
We also see a specific focus on analytic integrity within the intelligence agencies themselves. What's the concern there?
The concern, expressed quite directly in the sources, is about intelligence assessments being slanted or manipulated for political reasons, what's sometimes called cooking the books, or hyperpartisanship creeping into analysis.
Any specific examples cited?
Yes, they reference a report from the IC's analytic ombudsman expressing concern that certain CIA officials may have deliberately downplayed dissenting views regarding Beijing's intent to influence the 2020 U.S. election. The argument is that this violated core IC tradecraft standards, which require analysts to present all reasonable perspectives, especially dissenting ones, not just the conclusions favored by agency leadership.
Interesting. And in cyber defense, the plan advocates for an obligation to share policy. What does that entail?
It's essentially a duty to warn principle applied to cyber intelligence. It would mandate that when intelligence agencies discover new technical indicators of compromise, targeting data, or other actionable cyber threat intelligence, they have an obligation to share it rapidly within 48 hours is the suggested time frame with the targeted entities, whether they're private companies or government agencies, or even the public is necessary, to prevent or mitigate widespread cyber attacks.
Okay, shifting now to diplomacy and the State Department. The plan calls for drafting an Article X for China. That sounds significant. What is an Article X?
Yeah, the term itself evokes historical weight. It's described as a presidential mandate for a really deep, philosophical, long-term strategic assessment of the challenge posed by China. The goal is to move decisively beyond the current, often criticized approach of compete where we must but cooperate where we can.
So signaling a much more confrontational, perhaps existential view of the competition.
That seems to be the intent, an uncompromising stance framing it as a fundamental long-term struggle.
And when dealing with international organizations like the UN, the mandate is to actively oppose the promotion of certain social policies.
Correct. The plan directs the U.S. to oppose the use of international organizations and forums to promote what it terms radical social policies, specifically naming abortion access and pro-LGBT initiatives. The argument presented is that pushing these divisive issues undermines authentic human rights and damages U.S. credibility abroad by focusing on things that many cultures reject.
Okay. And USI, the main foreign aid agency, is also slated for major reform.
Yes. The sources note that USAID's mission has expanded significantly, with something like 80% of its humanitarian aid now going to responses to man-made crises, often involving large international bodies.
And the proposed change.
The plan calls for transitioning away from giving large grants primarily to UN agencies and big global NGOs. Instead, it wants to direct more funding towards local, especially faith-based entities on the ground in recipient countries.
Why that shift?
The sources argue these smaller, local, often faith-based groups are more effective, less bureaucratic, and less expensive delivery mechanisms for aid. Furthermore, the plan mandates much stricter branding policies, requiring that all U.S. aid be clearly marked to ensure the American people get full credit, which they argue helps counteract anti-American sentiment abroad.
All right, let's pivot to the economy, energy, and the whole regulatory apparatus. Starting with the Department of Energy, DOE, the goal here seems very explicit. Promote fossil fuels and essentially remove climate change as a primary driver of policy.
That's a fair summary. Structurally, they propose creating a new senior advisor role for energy and environmental policy, reporting directly to the White House Chief of Staff. This centralizes energy decisions right at the top. And simultaneously, they call for immediately abolishing the existing White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy.
Sending a pretty clear signal about priorities.
A very clear signal. It effectively ends the cabinet-level focus on climate change as a standalone issue.
And in terms of specific energy policy, they want to eliminate what they call political and climate change interference in approving exports of liquefied natural gas, LNG.
Yes. This would mean dramatically speeding up and expanding approvals for LNG export terminals. Specifically, the plan calls for expanding approvals to include all U.S. allies, explicitly mentioning NATO countries. The argument is that this leverages America's energy abundance for geopolitical advantage and economic strength, without getting bogged down in environmental reviews focused on climate impacts.
What about the national labs run by DOE? There are quite a few of them doing a lot of research.
There are 14 non-nuclear weapons labs. The plan calls for refocusing them solely on fundamental and advanced science, basic research.
And leaving what to the private sector?
Leaving technology demonstration and commercialization, things like building pilot plants or scaling up new technologies, entirely to the private sector. The argument is that government funding for these later-stage activities is often risky, politically influenced, and crowds out private investment.
And this focus on basic research extends to renewables, too. The Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EAR.
Yes, EAR would also be limited primarily to basic research, not funding technology deployment or market subsidies. And relatedly, they want to eliminate federal energy efficiency standards for appliances, refrigerators, washing machines, etc. They argue these standards represent regulatory overreach and should be scrapped, allowing the market to decide.
Okay. What about FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission? That's the independent agency that regulates pipelines and the power grid. What's the plan there?
They want FERC to recommit solely to its traditional mission, ensuring affordable and reliable energy, particularly natural gas. This means significantly limiting the scope of its environmental reviews when approving new pipelines.
How so?
They argue FERC should only consider the direct physical impacts of the pipeline itself and not conduct broader analyses of indirect upstream effects, like methane emissions from drilling, or downstream effects, like emissions from burning the gas. They basically want to sideline climate considerations in pipeline approvals.
And they mention grid reliability.
Yes, the sources explicitly note what they see as a growing threat to electric grid reliability in various regions, the RTOs. They blame this threat partly on the rapid influx of subsidized renewable energy sources, like wind and solar, which are intermittent. The implication is that FERC must prioritize grid reliability above pushing renewable energy mandates.
Okay, moving to the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The theme seems consistent. Reject climate-centric regulation entirely?
That's right. The core mandate proposed for the EPA is to get back to basics, focusing on tangible environmental health issues like clean air, safe drinking water, cleaning up hazardous waste sites, things with direct, measurable local impacts. They explicitly contrast this with focusing on the perceived threat of climate change.
And they argue the current approach presents a false choice.
Yeah, they argue the Biden EPA presents a false choice between having a healthy environment and having a strong economy, claiming you can have both if you focus regulation properly.
This sounds like it requires a major regulatory rollback. They specifically mention revising the Waters of the United States rule, WOTUS. That's been controversial for years.
Hugely controversial. The goal here is to revise WOTUS to dramatically restrict the federal government's jurisdiction over water bodies. They want to limit EPA's authority primarily to larger navigable waters and immediately adjacent wetlands, thereby, in their view, respecting private property rights and limiting federal overreach onto farms and small landowners.
What definition are they aiming for?
They call for codifying a definition that limits federal jurisdiction only to relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing bodies of water, citing language from Justice Scalia's opinion in the 2006 Supreme Court case, Rapanos v. United States, as the constitutional basis for this much narrower interpretation.
And beyond WOTUS, they also propose eliminating certain unauthorized regulatory inputs. What does that mean?
This gets into the weeds of how regulations are made. It includes eliminating concepts like the social cost of carbon. That's a complex metric administrations use to estimate the long-term economic damages caused by emitting greenhouse gases, which then gets factored into the cost-benefit analysis of new regulations.
So getting rid of that would likely make it harder to justify climate regulations.
Almost certainly. They also call for eliminating the use of black box and proprietary models in EPA rulemaking. arguing these complex computer models lack transparency and can be manipulated. And they mandate suspending and reviewing the EPA's scientific advisory bodies, citing concerns that these panels were purged of balanced perspectives under previous administrations and stacked with pro-regulatory scientists.
Okay, let's shift to trade policy. The source material identifies the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, as existential, particularly its economic aggression.
Absolutely. The threat is defined broadly. Mercantilist trade policies, state subsidies, intellectual property theft, technology forcing, using debt to gain leverage over other countries, the whole playbook. And the necessity isn't just to manage this, but to actively decouple the American economy from China's, especially in critical supply chains.
And they take aim at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, specifically the Most Favored Nation, or MFN rule. What's the problem with MFN, according to the plan?
MFN is a cornerstone of the WTO. It basically means you have to treat all your WTO trading partners equally regarding tariffs and trade rules. If you lower tariffs for one country, you have to lower them for all MFN partners.
Okay.
The sources argue this rule inherently harms countries like the U.S. that generally have low tariffs already. Why? Because it forces the U.S. to grant favorable market access to countries that maintain high tariffs against American goods. They argue it lacks fairness.
So what's the alternative they propose?
They advocate strongly for the principle of reciprocity. Basically, access to the U.S. market should be conditioned on our trading partners offering similar reciprocal access to American goods and services in their markets, tit for tat.
This naturally leads to the debate about tariffs themselves. The source material seems to acknowledge the arguments both for and against them, including citing the potential costs to consumers.
It does, and that's a crucial point. While proponents argue that high tariffs are necessary, maybe even unavoidable, to protect the domestic industrial base, especially from China,
Right.
the sources also present counter-arguments showing that tariffs can be very expensive for consumers and the broader economy. They cite specific studies, for example, estimating that the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum cost something like $650,000 for every steel job supposedly saved.
Wow.
And another estimate suggests that the Section 301 tariffs, specifically on Chinese goods, cost the average American household around $831 per year, mainly through higher prices on imported consumer goods. So there's an acknowledgement of the trade-offs.
Interesting. We also see a recommendation to just close the Export-Import Bank, EXIM. Why shut down a bank that's supposed to help U.S. companies export their goods?
The argument against EXIM is twofold. First, critics claim it doesn't actually finance additional exports that wouldn't have happened anyway. They argue it mostly just substitutes for private financing that was already available, often benefiting large corporations like Boeing.
And the second argument?
Second, they note that EXIM, particularly recently, has expanded its mission beyond just export finance to actively promote progressive policy goals. Things like limiting financing for fossil fuel projects overseas or promoting gender quotas in companies receiving financing. The sources see this as an inappropriate use of taxpayer-backed loans for political ends.
Okay, let's move finally in this section to financial regulation. The plan targets the very core of the reforms put in place after the 2008 financial crisis, recommending the repeal of key parts of the Dodd-Frank Act Titles First, 2, and 8.
Yeah, this is a direct assault on the post-crisis regulatory architecture. Title: I created the Financial Stability Oversight Council, FSOC, to monitor systemic risk. Title II established an orderly liquidation authority, allowing regulators to seize and wind down failing megabanks. Title VIII gave the Fed more oversight over systemically important payment systems.
And the argument for repealing these is?
The core argument is that creating FSOC and the Orderly Liquidation Authority actually failed to end too big to fail. Instead, they argue, it effectively enshrined the concept, basically guaranteeing that the government would step in to manage the failure of large, complex financial institutions, thus ensuring future taxpayer bailouts rather than preventing them through market discipline.
What about monetary policy? The Federal Reserve itself, the plan calls for a major shift there, too.
Yes, a fundamental shift. They push for the Fed to abandon its current dual mandate, which requires it to aim for both maximum employment and stable prices, and return to something stricter. Either a system based on commodity money, like a gold standard, which is unlikely, or at least a strict, predefined monetary policy rule, like targeting the money supply or a specific inflation rate.
Why the opposition to the dual mandate?
The argument is that the dual mandate gives the Fed too much discretion, allowing monetary policy to become unpredictable and potentially influenced by political pressures. They claim this discretion can inadvertently fuel asset bubbles and contribute to boom-bust cycles and recessions.
And they specifically tie the Fed's recent actions to rising housing costs.
Very directly. The plan notes the Federal Reserve's massive purchases of mortgage-backed securities, MBS, particularly since 2020 during the pandemic response. They cite these purchases as a primary driver of soaring housing costs, arguing it artificially inflated demand and prices in the housing market.
So what's the recommendation?
The plan calls for the Fed to be legally precluded from making any future MBS purchases and to actively wind down its current massive holdings of those securities, aiming to let the housing market return to more normal conditions.
Lastly, in this economic section, they recommend repealing the Corporate Transparency Act. This is a newer law enforced by FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. What's the issue here?
The Corporate Transparency Act requires millions of small businesses, basically any company with 20 or fewer employees, to report detailed information about their beneficial owners, the actual people who own or control the company, to the government. The stated goal is to fight money laundering and terrorist financing by making shell companies more transparent.
And the plan opposes this.
Yes, strongly. The sources call the implementing rule poorly written and incredibly overbroad. They argue it imposes billions of dollars in compliance costs, primarily on the smallest businesses, the ones least equipped to handle it, while likely failing to capture the sophisticated, high-level money laundering operations it was supposedly designed to target. They see it as a massive, burdensome intrusion on small business privacy.
All right, we're into the final major policy area, the Department of Justice, DOJ, and some related independent agencies. The core mandate for DOJ seems to be refocusing on traditional public safety duties and ending what the sources perceive as politicization.
Exactly. The number one priority must immediately shift back to reducing violent crime across the country. The plan would require the Attorney General to have all 94 U.S. attorneys create specific plans for their own jurisdictions, focusing federal law enforcement resources squarely on targeting violent offenders and career criminals.
And
explicitly not targeting, as the sources claim has happened, individuals like protesting parents who speak out critically at local school board meetings. The focus must be on actual crime, not political dissent.
Immigration enforcement also falls under DOJ. How is that treated? Aggressively.
Very aggressively. The sources frame the failure to fully enforce existing customs and immigration laws not just as a policy failure, but as a matter of life and death.
Why that framing?
They explicitly cite the devastating opioid crisis, noting over 100,000 overdose deaths annually, much of it driven by fentanyl smuggled across the southern border. The argument is that border security is inseparable from public safety.
So what's the directive for U.S. attorneys?
The plan mandates that all U.S. attorneys must prioritize prosecuting federal immigration offenses, including misdemeanors illegal entry. The goal is to ensure border enforcement is treated consistently as a fundamental rule of law issue across the entire country, not something left to the discretion of individual prosecutors or administrations.
Okay, what about ideology within the department? The plan calls for terminating all DDI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes, terminating all DEI programs and initiatives within the DOJ itself. Furthermore, it would direct the DOJ's Civil Rights Division to stop initiating investigations or bringing lawsuits under Title VI. That's the law prohibiting race discrimination in federally funded programs, if those cases are based exclusively on allegations of disparate impact.
What's the distinction there? Disparate impact versus...
Disparate impact means a policy or practice might be neutral on its face, but has a disproportionately negative effect on a particular racial group, even without proof of intentional discrimination. The plan argues the DOJ should only pursue civil rights cases where there's actual evidence of intentional discrimination, not just statistical imbalances.
There's also a really fascinating legal critique in the DOJ section regarding the First Amendment. It specifically references the government's arguments in the 303 Creative Supreme Court case involving the Christian web designer.
Yes, this is presented as a prime example of perceived government overreach and viewpoint discrimination. In that case, involving a web designer who didn't want to create websites for same-sex weddings due to her religious beliefs.
Right.
The DOJ argued in court that the government could legally compel her, the Christian designer, to create those websites against her beliefs. But crucially, the DOJ also argued, according to the sources, that the government could not compel an LGBT web designer to create websites promoting opposite-sex marriage if it violated their beliefs.
So different standards depending on the viewpoint.
That's exactly how the plan frames it. They argue this specific legal position demonstrates the government actively trying to pick and choose which viewpoints get First Amendment protection and which don't, based on whether the government approves of the message.
Mhm.
They see this as fundamentally unconstitutional and demand it be immediately reversed.
Okay. And one more DOJ item. They recommend reinstating the department's China initiative. That was ended, right?
It was terminated by the Biden administration in early 2022. There were concerns raised about potential racial profiling of scientists of Chinese descent and whether it created a climate of fear in academia.
But the plan argues it should be brought back.
Yes. Despite acknowledging the optics concerns, the plan argues the underlying national security threat remains acute and requires a dedicated initiative. They even cite the Biden administration's own national security strategy, which correctly identified China as America's only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Therefore, they argue, a dedicated counter-espionage initiative focused on China is essential.
Okay, finally, let's look at independent agencies, specifically the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. The focus here seems to be reining in big tech and national security.
That's right. On big tech, the plan proposes the FCC take action regarding Section 230 of the Communications Act. That's the law that famously grants broad immunity to online platforms for content posted by their users.
And the proposal is for the FCC to reinterpret Section 230. How?
The proposal is for the FCC to issue an order or rule interpreting Section 230 in a way that significantly narrows that immunity, particularly for dominant tech platforms. They want to eliminate what they call the expansive non-textual immunities that courts have read into the statute over the years. The likely goal is to make platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter more legally accountable for their content moderation decisions, potentially exposing them to more lawsuits.
That would be a huge change. And for national security at the FCC.
They want more transparency about foreign influence. The FCC should publish and maintain a public foreign adversary transparency list.
What would be on this list?
It would include every single entity that holds any kind of FCC authorization licenses for broadcasting, satellite communications, undersea cables, etc., that has more than 10% ownership traceable back to foreign adversarial governments. They specifically list China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as examples. The goal is to force transparency about who might have foreign government influence over critical U.S. communications infrastructure. #tag outro. So, okay, let's try and pull this all together. What does it all mean? When you synthesize all these different policy areas we've touched on, I mean, the proposed changes to DOE, the overhaul of the military, redefining Title IXs, the deep structural assault on the administrative state itself, the scale of the shift proposed in Project 2025 is just, it's massive.
Yeah, massive is the word. It really covers a return to what they see as constitutional, original intent, limited government. It pushes aggressive cultural priorities centered on the traditional family and values, and it outlines this incredibly uncompromising national security posture, laser focused on China as the primary adversary.
And it's all built on that core belief, right? That the executive branch, as it currently exists, has been fundamentally weaponized against the American populace, or at least against conservative values. So every single policy recommendation seems designed not just to implement a new agenda, but to physically dismantle the existing structures they believe resist that agenda.
Yeah, dismantle the resistance. And the document itself, it repeatedly emphasizes the timeline, doesn't it? That the next administration has, what was it, 2 years and one chance to get it right.
Exactly. There's this real sense of urgency. The authors seem to believe that if they fail to implement these deep structural changes very rapidly within that first 2-year window, then institutional resistance, the bureaucracy, the courts, the media, political opposition will inevitably solidify, and the window of opportunity will just slam shut.
So the ultimate challenge the document really addresses, and maybe the provocative final thought we can leave you with today, is exactly that question. How can an administration, even one armed with a plan this comprehensive and staffed with deeply committed personnel, actually succeed in redirecting such a massive, entrenched, decades-old federal bureaucracy? Especially a bureaucracy that the authors themselves claim is already actively working against the presidential mandate they seek to impose.
And flipping that question, what would be the immediate and the lasting consequences both here at home and around the world if this level of fundamental structural reorientation actually succeeds? Or, for that matter, if it's attempted and fails? The stakes, as presented in this document, feel incredibly high.